Hi everybody, welcome to class. Welcome to part 2 of doing research in social problems. I'm glad you're still with me. So I separated this part out because we're going to be talking about the different methods that you can use to collect data, and we kind of want to talk about them in isolation. So our think, pair, share or discussion questions. How many research methods, data collection methods can you list? What's the difference between qualitative and quantitative data? Now, if you didn't notice already, a lot of things have two different terms, or the terms are interchangeable. So if, research definitions and statistics wasn't hard enough, a lot of things have more than one term that means the same thing, or it has one term that could mean multiple things. So I try my best to say all of them when I'm talking about them, so that you can get used to the different terminology and you know what someone's talking about when they're using only one specific terminology. So let's first talk about the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. So often what qualitative and quantitative data means is the degree of structure to which you are doing your research or collecting your data. So qualitative data is most often semi-structured. It can be unstructured, meaning it's open-ended, so you're not going to have a lot of structure in how the questions are answered. Think a essay question as opposed to a multiple choice question. So an essay question would be considered semi-structured. You know that you should be getting an answer on that topic, but how the person words it, what they say, how much they say, that's up to them. Quantitative data collection would be you give them the question and the answer options, and so you know what the answer options are. That would be structured data collection. So most often the questions are open-ended, like an essay question. Most often you're doing qualitative data with smaller populations, and that's because qualitative data is harder to analyze. When I say harder to analyze what I mean is it is more tedious and time consuming to analyze because you don't have structured answers. The answers are all over the place. So people tend to do smaller populations with qualitative data because of the amount of on-hand, by hand analyzation that you have to do. Does that mean that it's always going to be a small population that you're analyzing with qualitative data? Absolutely not. There are absolutely research studies out there with huge sample populations, huge target populations that have qualitative data as their data collection method or part of their data collection method. They do tend to be what people might say is easier to develop. And what we mean by that is it's simply easier to write an open-ended question or survey because it's less time consuming, but then it's more time consuming and more tedious to analyze that open-ended question. What this allows for is something that's very important. Qualitative data allows you to get a complex and in-depth understanding on a topic, and quantitative data often does not allow for that. So you are open to information that you may not know already exists. You're open to a variety of information, and you're open to nuances that you wouldn't find with just quantitative data alone. Quantitative data tends to be structured data collection. So we were talking about, the multiple choice as opposed to an open-ended question. So you have closed-ended questions, meaning you have a set established answers, and those are the only way someone can answer. You tend to use this with larger populations. It's easier to disseminate, for example, a survey to 10,000 people if it's a structured data collection. So we tend to use more quantitative data methods with larger populations. You have very simple, well-defined measures, so they're going to be very concrete, well-defined, and clear. Oftentimes you're expressing that information numerically. They can be harder to develop and easier to analyze, meaning those quote-unquote simple, well-defined measures, those multiple choice questions take more time, and can give you and have like more problems that can emerge from the way that you write the question. So they take more critiquing and rewriting and editing and reviewing than the qualitative does. But once you have them down and they are correct, if they are correctly written, they tend to be easier to analyze. In other words, you're not dealing with a mess of different information here. You might have volumes of information, but everybody's answered the same way. So in that way, we mean it's just less tedious to analyze. Okay, so let's talk about the different ways you can collect data. And these are called research methods as well, right? So remember we were talking about terminology being used for multiple different things. So data collection methods are called research methods. So what we're going to cover today is secondary data analysis, experimental research, observations, both participant and or obtrusive observation and unobtrusive observation, participant or non-participant observation, survey research, interviews and focus group, case studies and content analysis. So just kind of a review in the process, right? Define the problem, review the literature, select a research design. So this is where we're focused on today. So in order to be able to select and design a research design for a research project, you need to already know and understand your different options so that you could pick and choose your options and put them together. This is a higher level thinking process, meaning it's not just I tell you information and you tell it back to me. It's I tell you information or you learn information, you need to learn it, memorize it, understand it, select from it, and create something new. That's on Bloom's taxonomy, that's the higher level critical analysis thinking. You're creating the artwork from all of the components. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is classical or quasi-experimental research designs. So experimental research designs, this is the one that's most commonly used in what people might call the hard sciences, like the medical field. It's something that would be done in a lab, but it can also be done in the social sciences. It's just not often done in the social sciences. So we're going to talk about classical or quasi, the difference between classical and quasi-experimental designs here. An experimental design is any design that is set up in this kind of variation, or this, I guess this structure is what you would call it. So you need to have assignment, either random or non-random assignment of your groups. So say, for example, you have two groups of students. You can either randomly assign them to groups or non-randomly assign them to group. You have your observations, which is also a test of some sort. So an observation can be anything from observing people working to giving them a blood test, drawing blood for a medical test. And then you have your independent variable. So that's the thing that is going to cause the change, or you may think will cause the change. So say, for example, you have students here. You can randomly assign your students. You do an observation. In this case, maybe I will do a test on how much you know about research methods. And then my independent variable is the lecture, and then you get another test on how to do on your research methods. So that would be considered a design, right? So a classical design always is set up this way. It has 4 groups. You have random assignment into all 4 groups. Now, the more random an assignment is into groups, the more generalizable you are. So the more you can generalize from your sample, which are these groups, to your target population. Remember, samples, target population, and population. So random assignment and experimental research designs in general lend themselves towards validity and reliability, and therefore lend themselves towards generalizability, meaning you can generalize from your sample to your target population and possibly even to the general population. They lend towards reliability and validity because they're highly structured and because you're repeating the same process over and over again, and you have a predetermined set of conceptualizations and experiments and observations. And so they tend to be more generalizable, more valid, and more reliable. So what's a quasi-experimental design? Sometimes you can't do this particular design. So anything that varies from that particular design would be a quasi-experimental design. Here's 3 different examples of that, but a researcher may do any type of variation, and that would be considered a quasi-experimental design. So you can have random assignment. So these 2 only have 2 groups. You have random assignment into both groups. And then you have your independent variable and 1 observation. Notice the observation, the pretest, is missing here. And we only gave our test to 1 of the groups. So here you have a test to 2 groups and you have 2 observations. So what they're testing here is to see if the pretest caused the change by the post-test and not the independent variable. And here they're testing to see if it was the pretest and the independent variable combined. So if you think of the pretest as maybe, a blood test, and then you have the medication, and then you have the post-test, well, maybe the pretest caused some change. And so they just want to make sure that that's not the case, and that's why you would have in a classic experimental design 4 groups always, so that you could do that. Now on this one you have non-random assignment. You have your pretest, your independent variable, and your post-test. So this can happen if it's not ethical to or not possible to randomly assign people. So say for example you have groups of students in a class, and they want to be involved in a program, or your independent variable is a program to help you get into college. And the school says you cannot randomly assign people into this program. If they would like to enter into college or enter into this program, they're allowed to enter into the program. So here you would have non-random assignment. You might have a pretest of your likelihood of getting into 3 different colleges. And then you have the program, and then you have the post-test that would also measure the likelihood of being able to get into those 3 different colleges. This is going to test if that program actually increased or changed your potential to get into these colleges. And then sometimes we have something like this, which could be the program, so anybody can enter. There is no assignment, random or otherwise. So you have the independent variable and an after observation. Now, clearly this has its own problems, but it's better than nothing. And so at least you have a program and a test afterwards. This often happens in nonprofit organizations. They're offering a program. There is no choice. People either come in or they don't come in. They can't separate into two groups. Everybody gets the option, or everybody who goes into that program then gets a test afterwards, right? So maybe it's anger management. Everybody who comes into the anger management gets the anger management class, and everybody gets the post-test. Another way that you can change that quasi-experimental design that you see in nonprofits is, here's possibly your independent variable / anger management test. Here's an observation or test that you post-test that you get after, and then you can add. So maybe that happened as soon as you got out, 1 day after, and then you add another one 2 weeks after, and then you add another one 1 month after, and then you add another one 6 weeks after. You see what I'm doing there? So you can have an XOOOO, right? And it becomes more longitudinal. So why do we do experimental designs or quasi-experimental designs? We kind of talked a little bit about this. So sometimes it's simply not legal to do a complete classic experimental design. It might not be ethical. Oftentimes it's not practical. So we talked about a couple different options in nonprofit organizations, in schools, in medical facilities. It is not always legal, ethical, or practical to do those. Now, experimental designs, the closer you can get to experimental designs, the more internal validity you have, meaning you are measuring what you intend on measuring, and you're not varying from that internally. So quasi-experimental designs kind of have a moderate amount of internal validity, and correlational designs, meaning just looking at if two variables are correlated, those tend to have the least amount of validity, which is why you find spurious correlations. So observations, there are two types of observations, what we might call participant or non-participant observations, otherwise known as obtrusive or unobtrusive observations. So an obtrusive observation is that people know that they're being observed. You're observing people's actual behavior. The disadvantage to that is that they are often going to change their behavior because they know that they're being observed. Unobtrusive observations, people don't know that they're being observed. So the advantage to that is that they won't change their behavior because they know they're being observed. The disadvantage to that is often that people consider that unethical, that you should know that you're being observed. So the way that I like to, or the example I like to give in like Intro to Soc or in an Intro to Methods is, say for example, your boss comes and asks you on a scale of 1 to 10 how hard you work. You're going to say, I work at like a 10. I'm always working really hard. You are not necessarily going to get the most reliable, valid data if you ask somebody how hard they work at their job. You're more likely to get more valid or accurate data if you watch people work. So if you watch all of your employees working and you create a measurement for how hard they're working, how quickly they're working, how much effort they're putting into each task, or how accurately they're completing each task, you're going to get a more accurate reading of how hard they're working. You can do observations in a variety of different ways. So it can be qualitative or quantitative. It can be structured, it can be semi-structured, or it can be unstructured. So if I'm doing a very structured observation, I'm going to have a checklist in front of me. I'm counting people. I could be timing people. So think when you go to Costco and they're clicking that button every time a group comes in, they're clicking every card essentially. So that's a structured observation that they're doing. They're counting the number of people coming in. So that is structured, semi-structured, because they're counting groups. If I count every single person and I know how many are children, how many are adults, and how many carts, I would consider that to be a very structured observation. Semi-structured, you would give the observer, the researcher, kind of general guidelines, and they might be counting just in general how many people they believe come in. So that's more what they're doing, kind of like groups. They're counting cards, right? So you get a general idea of how many people are coming in. You could be looking at, like with semi-structured, maybe you're looking at a location. So you're looking at, you know, the average amount of people that you believe is there, the layout, you know, what you think is going on, right? So you might come with kind of an open-ended checklist. You know, what are people doing? How many people are lingering? How many people are moving in and out, right? That's kind of semi-structured. Postmodern or unstructured, again, two words that mean the same thing. So everything is recorded and there's no checklist, there's no defined criteria when you get there. This one I would consider to be the most difficult. You might just have a time frame. You go from 8 a.m. to 8:10 a.m. and record everything. That means everything you see, everything you hear, everything you smell. You want the layout, you want the people, you want animals, you want food that's being eaten. All of that stuff is to be included. Everything that the researcher experiences should be included in postmodern recording. You can imagine, quite challenging to do that and quite chaotic to do that. Okay, survey research. So survey research, again, could be structured, semi-structured, or unstructured. And survey research simply means that you have a written survey that you're doing. It can have open-ended questions. It can have multiple choice questions with an option like other to fill stuff in, or it can have very structured answers and questions. But you have a survey that's concrete, that is pre-written. You have something in hand. Now that can be done face-to-face, where I ask you questions and I'm writing down the answers. They used to do these by mail. Nobody really does anymore. By telephone, or you now sometimes see them online, on the internet, even on social media. You'll see surveys where you take a little survey and then it gives you an emoji, that kind of thing, right? So that's a survey. Clearly the ones on social media, they're not valid scientific surveys, but I'm just giving you an example. They can vary considerably in format and length. And some of the issues that emerge from surveys are the respondents' attitudes. Now, people in general don't like taking surveys. If you hand them a written survey and you ask them to write the answers, you're always going to get less information than if you ask them the questions and have them verbally tell you the answers. The nature of the questions can cause issue as well. One of the reasons why you always see the personal questions at the end is that if you ask somebody how old they are and how much money they make at the very beginning, they're likely to say, I'm done, I'm not taking this survey. But if you ask them at the very end of the survey, they are more likely, they're like, oh, okay, I answered all these questions. Yeah, I'm this age and I make this amount of money. Surveys, depending on how they're structured and how they're delivered, can be kind of an effective, low-cost way of collecting data. If you're not doing it in person, every single one, they're not extremely expensive, but you also have a low return rate. So if somebody isn't personally asking you to answer the questions, you're more likely to just throw it in the trash or say no and not do it. They do tend to have more reliability, and their validity is moderate. So the validity really, especially the internal validity, depends on how well done the survey questions are, and that's its own skill by itself, creating research questions that actually measure what you're intending on measuring. Now, if you can get that, they can work great, at least for a short period of time, until norms or values or ideologies or even definitions of things change. So even a very well-written survey, like for example, the one on racism that was done in the 1950s, I believe, is no longer a very valid survey. It was pretty valid in the 50s. It's really longitudinal. They've been giving it, I think, every 5 to 10 years for the past 70 years or so. But the questions were great at measuring racism in the 50s, but do not do a good job at measuring racism today. It is, however, very reliable. Once they're written, they're written. So you're asking the same questions and you don't have any variation over time or depending on the person asking the questions. So extremely reliable, but became less valid over time. Interviews and focus groups. So interviews and surveys sometimes are often used interchangeably. When you say an interview, what you simply mean is you're doing that survey either structured or unstructured, face-to-face. And when you're doing it with a focus group, you're doing it with more than one person at a time. So again, they can be structured, semi-structured, or postmodern in their structure. A structured interview is going to have a very predetermined set of questions. It's going to look like more of a survey. It's probably already going to have the sub-questions set. You're not allowed to go on a tangent. You're not allowed any flexibility if it's very structured. If it's semi-structured, you might already have your predetermined set of questions and sub-questions, but if somebody starts to add in pertinent information that's different, you're allowed the flexibility to follow that topic. So say, for example, you're doing market research and you're in Target and you're talking to women about which shampoo they would use and why, right? And you have your predetermined set of questions and you have your predetermined set of sub-questions, but it's a semi-structured survey or interview. So if somebody says something different that will cue you into different marketing information, you're allowed to ask follow-up questions of that. So say, for example, a woman says, yes, I pick these types of shampoos, but I don't like my husband to ever use my shampoos because they're so expensive. So then you can ask follow-up questions about sharing, not sharing shampoos, what might make you more likely to buy an expensive shampoo. Like you could ask a question like, well, if it came with an additional shampoo for your husband, would that increase your chances of buying or increase the likelihood that you would buy that shampoo to try it out? And then that person can answer that question, right? That offers a little bit of flexibility. Postmodern or unstructured, you would essentially almost never see in marketing, but you might see it in sociology. Somebody goes in and asks somebody, you know, about shopping or about why they're participating in a social movement, right? And so they're going in and doing observations and participating themselves and then asking people questions, but they're deciding often on the questions that they ask when they get there and based on what they're observing and the feedback that they get. That's unstructured or postmodern. It's valid in and of itself. A valid type of research, excuse me. You are not going to have much reliability, none there. It's great for exploring topics, the unstructured interviews. You're not going to have reliability over time. You're not going to have any reliability from one researcher to the next researcher. But you can really often glean some really important information or new information that you didn't expect. So it's great as exploratory research and often used for that. So some of the benefits of interviews, often you can do them fairly quickly, so-so. They are moderately expensive. It costs money to have people meet with other people face to face. You get fairly good quality data from interviews. That's my rice, it's done. You get fairly good quality from interviews. You often don't get a ton of quantity. The more quantity you want, the more money it's going to cost you and time it's going to cost you. It does have a lot of internal validity issues. And if you're doing, depending on who you're interviewing, the other person can hijack the interview. So you might have issues with what we call moderator control. Focus groups, let's start at the bottom, tend to have fairly big issues with moderator control. So focus groups, the goal of a focus group is to interview groups of people over and over again until you start to hear the same information come out of each of the groups. So you might have occasionally gotten a request to do an interview after you buy a car where they're going, come talk to us about this car you bought, be in this focus group. So they'll have between 6 and 12 people in a focus group. 6 to 8 people is the easiest to control. You're going to have more moderator control the less people you have. The more people you have, the less control you have over those people flirting with each other, going off on tangents, taking the topic in a direction that you don't want it to go. So you lose moderator control as you increase the number of people, especially when you haven't practiced focus groups before. So they're a skill in and of themselves. They have okay internal validity. They're actually pretty good. Because you're looking for the same theme to emerge over and over again, you do start to, if you can hone in on that concept and continue that, you can have pretty good validity. You can measure what you want to measure. Sometimes they save you money and time because over interviewing one person at a time. And it seems like you could get more people, but you're not necessarily getting more information. Case studies. Whew, I'm getting tired. So case studies. So generally a case study is a study of an individual person, if you're a psychologist, a small group of people, sometimes sociologists or someone else does it. Can't think of at the moment. Companies and organizations. So I know personally of a case study. So NASA, there was a case study done by a sociologist who happened to be a professor of mine at University of Houston, who did a case study on NASA, and he found that there would likely be there was some internal breakdown in their communication system that could arise to problems or some kind of crisis. And that's exactly what ended up happening about 4 or 5 years after he did the case study. He gave them the report. They promptly ignored it because why would they care? They're NASA, right? He's just a sociologist. That's when they had that O-ring breakdown. There was internal reports letting people know that was a problem. It never went up the chain far enough. It somehow just got lost in the noise, and that was the explosion that killed the teacher that they had come on to go up, to the moon in the 1980s. So yeah, that didn't work out very well for them. Another case study that I've seen In peer-reviewed literature that emerges, there's been a lot of case studies of Time Warner and their anti-union efforts. They've made huge anti-union efforts, and so they deunionized, and they've been able to squash all unions or worker organizations, and they've done a really good job at pushing down workers' rights and workers' pay and that kind of stuff. So there's been a few case studies regarding that particular organization that are published. The biggest issue is generalizability with case studies. You cannot generalize to the population or a target population with a case study. The case study is a single case study. So it just studies that one person. It can only talk about that one person, that one group, or that one company or organization. It can never be generalized. But it is very useful in generating new hypotheses or understanding other methods that are suitable for testing and theory. There are other methods, that are more suitable for testing and theory building. But case studies are really great at generating hypotheses or going deeper and exploring deeper a particular case. Okay, content analysis. So 15 years ago when I started in sociology, content analysis was very rarely done. I think I knew one colleague who was doing content analysis on social media. Today, it's probably one of the more common ones, I would say. Content analysis is a systematic analysis of any particular content that you've defined. So maybe that's Facebook, social media, or it's films, or it's visual arts, or cartoons, right? So whenever you're analyzing movies or content, Disney movies are a huge one, right? So content analysis is a repeated systematic observation and analysis of a particular subset of content. So we've seen this done consistently and actually just done a lot on Disney movies. If you go in just into JSTOR, into your school's library, and you research Disney gender, a ton of articles will come up on, gendered analysis of Disney movies or racial analysis of Disney movies, that kind of stuff. So anytime you're doing an analysis of a particular, usually online topic, so films, stories, you can do books of any kind, you can do music content analysis. Social media has been a really huge one now that people do content analysis. It's often done by hand. It's pretty tedious and time consuming. There are computer programs that do content analysis, but they, forgive my language, they suck. They miss all nuances. So these are still done by human beings. So you're watching maybe 3 Disney movies over and over and over again, or you're reviewing the same blogs over and over and over again, and you're doing a continuous, usually qualitative analysis, and making that qualitative analysis go from unstructured to semi-structured to extremely structured, and you're doing all of those variation and analyzing that particular subset or topic. They're fairly reliable. Somewhat generalizable. Okay, so I'm going to teach you a term. We are going to rubber duck it, or that's what I would like you to do. So you have to play along again. So in class, you would turn to the person next to you and describe each of the following: content analysis, surveys, focus groups, case studies, and the difference between classical and quasi-experimental designs. In programming, in computer programming, you're not sitting next to somebody, right? And you're probably not sitting next to somebody now. So I would like you to get a rubber duck, a toy, anything that you can find, a stuffed animal, set it on your computer, and I would like you, as silly as you feel, to explain the topics. Verbally explaining these topics to something, whether it's tangible or intangible, means that you will understand it, you will learn it better, you will remember more of it, and if you're confused or it doesn't make sense, you will clarify it in the process of explaining it to your rubber ducky. So I would love to see in your video who your rubber duck was. And I actually used to do this. I did learn this from a computer programmer. This is a real thing and it really works. So I know it might feel silly, but please take my word and try it. So your goal here is to rubber duck content analysis, surveys, focus groups, case studies, and explain the difference between classical experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs. That's it for today. Have a great day.